Welcome back to movementprofessional.com. So I'm going to go over some supine variations to improve mobility on the ground as well as to get an assessment of posture. So we're going to look at hookline first, which is just on your back with your knees bent to about a 45-degree angle. And what we can see here is actually what does the neck want to do when you're in this position. So for those who have a real tight thoracic spine, you actually may not be able to have the head rest on the ground without the chin really poking up, and that's your first assessment right there. So you might have to fill that space in with a towel roll or some type of pillow. The next thing we're going to look at is straightening the legs, and this would be a full supine position. So when we add the extension of the knees, now we have to deal with some tension in the anterior chain and the quads, which you may want to pull the lumbar spine into extension or the pelvis into an anterior rotation. All right, so we can assess what the lumbar curve looks like there, and then we're going to go overhead with the arms. So as we go overhead with the arms, we'll get some tension in the lats and similar muscles in that area, which is going to further pull the spine into extension if there's tightness. So I'm a good example of that tightness. So as soon as my arms go overhead, I can get the hands to the ground, but you can see an increase extension curvature in the spine, and then also the front part of my lower ribs also want to elevate there as well. So the awareness is the battle here when you're in these positions. So it's not dangerous for me to do that unless I'm having pain and kind of working through it. But one thing that I can do is if I feel that extension happening and that compensation, I could fight against it. So this position becomes a great exercise to teach bracing against your compensations when you go overhead. So if you're overhead pressing or you're doing anything overhead, you can see the first thing that's going to want to happen is your spine's going to want to go into extension. So when I'm in that position, I can use the ground as feedback and draw my ribs down and brace through my core to help me appreciate the relationship between overhead and midline stabilization. Then I'm going to go into a straddle position and assess that, see what that feels like. A lot of times it'll take some of the tension off of the anterior chain, so I won't have to fight as hard for the taking me out of extension in the lumbar spine. And then we can look at more of the overhead position out in a scaption angle. So I like to think of this as just like making an X with the body and exploring the fascial planes there from fingertips to the opposite toes and seeing what that feels like. Often that's not as tight as the full overhead supine position because, again, you're taking the anterior chain and hip flexors out of it a little bit. You're assessing more of the adductors and then also the pec when you go out into more of that wider V position with the shoulders. All right, so again, you can use the ground as feedback and try to do some pelvic tilting or bracing where you're dropping the ribs and just see how that changes the stretch in the shoulders, changes the stretch in the hips. All right, so it's important to be able to use the ground as feedback to just appreciate relationships between the midline, the core, the ribs, pelvis, and shoulders and hips. Then we can go into a supine butterfly position where we put the feet together and then actively try to open the knees and see what that does to the spine. So often as we try to move into external rotation with the hips, the spine will also want to go into extension. So it becomes an important bracing cue there as the knees try to reach towards the ground, the outer part of the knees reach towards the ground, that we want to make sure we're bracing through the midline. And then we can test this hand behind head position, which is shoulder flexion, abduction, and external rotation. Often that's a great position to help neutralize the cervical spine. But again, the rib cage is going to want to rotate posteriorly, elevating the front ribs. All right, so we want to really make sure as the hands go overhead, and if there's some tightness in the shoulders, we are bracing against that hyper rotation into a posterior rotation of the rib cage. All right, so all of these become stretches in themselves. You can spend as much time as you feel comfortable there. And I like to think of ground mobility as a way to counter the low load stretching that you're doing throughout the course of the day when you're in positions of sitting, you're in positions of sleeping, standing, and just the positions we don't even think about that we're in the most frequently tend to be the ones that are going to make us the tightest. So we can use the ground to counter those, and we can spend longer periods of time in these positions. So those are supine variations to improve mobility on the ground. If you have any questions, you can go to movementprofessional.com. I'll see you next time.